world continues to witness the horrors of a murdered Israeli hostage, the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian women, children, the recent missile strike that caused the deaths of 3 British aid workers, and the killing of many more aid workers and journalists in Gaza, it is easy to lose focus on what is also happening in the West Bank and Jerusalem. I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of CMEC, the Conservative Middle East Council. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Seidemann from Jerusalem to talk about recent troubling developments in the city and across the West Bank. Daniel Seidemann has been a practicing attorney in Jerusalem and a partner in a firm specializing in commercial law since 1987. He specializes in legal and public issues in occupied East Jerusalem, particularly those related to government and municipal policies and practices. He has argued more than 20 Jerusalem-related cases before the Israeli Supreme Court and participated in numerous Track 2 talks on Jerusalem between Israelis and Palestinians. He's frequently consulted by governmental bodies in Israel, Palestine, and the international community on matters pertaining to Israel-Palestine relations and developments in Jerusalem. Daniel, welcome to the CMEC podcast.
Welcome to you as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I know that we all condemn Hamas's terror attacks on October the 7th, which were truly brutal and diabolical. But it seemed then that the West and some of the Arab world had assumed that that age-long Israel-Palestine issue had gone away after the Abraham Accords, and as Saudi Arabia was beginning discussions about normalization with Israel. On October the 6th, it didn't seem to be top of anyone's agenda. Did the attacks take you and other Israelis by surprise?
The answer is yes and no. I have been working with a small group of former decision makers, diplomats, among them one of the best diplomats ever to serve on the Middle East, and that's Alistair Burt, for the last couple of years. And we were in London, Washington, and other capitals, and we were saying there's going to be a war. Get ready for the war. More importantly, get ready for the consequences of the war, because nobody is going to be able to stop the outbreak of a war. There just isn't enough energy focused on Israel-Palestine that will prevent a war. That may make us look smart, but curb your enthusiasm. We had no idea that the war would have such a shattering, seminal impact on everything we believe in. When I say everything we believe in, I'm saying Israelis, Palestinians, and the international community. We anticipated a war and warned about it. We did not in any way anticipate this war.
I'm going to come at the end of the podcast, I think, to talk about whether you think there's anything we could have done better to prevent something that was expected but took us all by surprise in its brutality. But before I do that, can you describe to us, many of our listeners will have watched these horrors on screens. Can you take me through what it's been like living in Jerusalem since October the 7th? Reaction to the Hamas attacks, and then as things developed, reaction to Netanyahu and the IDF's response. What has it been like?
Well, I'm in a curious situation because I live in Jerusalem, but I'm on the job. And my job is to keep an eye on Jerusalem when everybody's looking at Gaza and make sure the city doesn't blow up, which it has not, much to everybody's surprise, including my own. But obviously, the war has not passed over Jerusalem, either Palestinians or Israelis. The communication between Israelis and Palestinians living in the same city has disintegrated. It is the fortunate few, and I'm lucky to be among them, where the channels of communication remain. It's become an extinguished city on both sides of the line. Both Israeli society and Palestinian society have been traumatized, each for our own reasons. Everybody is involved in this conflict, even in Jerusalem. Last night, one of the talking heads said, all over the country, people are buying out all of the stock of grocery stores because they fear a war in the north or a war with Iran, except in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, things are as normal. Nobody's, rushing and buying water and, canned goods, etc. Well, number one, we're used to it. And number two, we're lucky to have Al-Aqsa. We have been spared the brunt of the war. We've heard a few air raid sirens, but Jerusalem hasn't been targeted. Having said that, Jerusalem remains the epicenter. The final word has not been said. Ramadan is not over. And if there's any one issue or cause that can ignite a regional war, it's here in Jerusalem.
Could you just expand on what you mean by when you say you're blessed to have Al-Aqsa? Are you saying that that makes attacks less likely because it's a holy site for the Muslims? What do you mean?
It's been an assumption that has rarely been articulated, but has been articulated, that missiles will be directed towards Jerusalem, but not at Jerusalem, lest Al-Aqsa be hit. And indeed, in one of the last rounds, there was an intercept pretty much over Al-Aqsa, not perhaps precisely, but to a certain extent, Jerusalemites are a bit pampered, even though we would never admit it. Look, all of us have loved ones in the reserves, family on my side that has been in combat units in Gaza and in other meaningful tasks, and friends, Palestinian friends of many years who remain friends, have lost family in the absolute carnage of Gaza. So it's not that we're unaffected, but we sort of get a pass on the direct hit, at least at this point.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of CMEC, and I'm speaking to Daniel Seidemann, Israeli attorney from Jerusalem. Since April the 1st, on April the 1st, Israel attacked Iran's consulate in Syria and killed a number of senior leaders of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, according to the Pentagon. And America says that it has intelligence that retaliation is expected. Has that cast a very tangible shadow over the way you live at the moment?
It's palpable. People have now understood maybe it's a good time to open the shelters, buy canned goods, and get a generator because the electricity may be out. It's not a real sense of panic, but there is a very clear sense that events in the north can careen out of control, that neither our government nor any other government is going to determine on its own whether this happens, and we have to be prepared for that. Today, more than ever, Israelis are prepared, at least psychologically, for a regional war. I never thought I'd be saying these words.
Some might say, from some of the provocative actions that are taking place, particularly in the West Bank, and I'd like to talk about that in a bit, that Netanyahu seems to be actively provoking a global conflict. Is that a fair analysis?
I've never met Netanyahu, but I've been playing chess with him for the last 30 years, and I kind of get a sense of how he operates, and he operates today much differently than the past. Of this, I have no doubt. He has a personal interest in prolonging the war. He has a personal interest in deprioritizing the hostages. He has a personal interest in setting out his attack dogs, the slurmongers, against the most vulnerable people in Israel, those whose children, husbands, fathers are in Gaza, and that the interest of Israel comes second. I have followed Netanyahu for all these many years, and I've always found him to be full of bluster but risk averse. Actually, until 5 years ago, gave him pretty good marks, pretty good grades on how he handled lots of the Temple Mount. That's no longer the case. And Netanyahu sees himself in Churchillian terms. He is our Churchill, and he may be looking for, the greatest challenge of civilization. He's been urging an attack on Iran for years. It has not happened, thank God. I hope it won't. But would I rule out the possibility that Netanyahu is doing things that raise the risk of a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran? I can't rule that out. And that's another thing I never thought I'd be saying.
That's quite something to say. And I know a lot of our listeners will be really shocked, and perhaps some will be offended to hear something like that. How does the history of Netanyahu's relationship with the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in Gaza play into that allegation or suggestion you've just made?
Netanyahu had a concept, a way of looking at the world, and that was, if I understand him correctly, and I think I'm in a better position than most, not only because I studied with his father at Cornell, which was actually an educational experience in more ways than one, but I've seen how he thinks and operates. Netanyahu doesn't believe in peace. He believes that life is perpetual skirmishing and warfare, and only the smartest and the strongest persist. And the goal of the state of Israel in this state of perpetual hostility is to manage the conflict to the best of our abilities. If that means, on occasion, paying lip service to supporting the two-state solution, sure, words are cheap. Netanyahu's concept was distilled, and it was distilled into the following: I do not want any governance other than Israel to the west of the Jordan River. That means I do not want an empowered Palestinian Authority, much less a Palestinian state. The best way of marginalizing the Palestinians is by coddling Hamas. Hamas is pragmatic, he thought. They're interested in governance. They've abandoned jihad. They can be bribed with periodic sorties reminding them how strong we are, and that will absolve us from dealing with the fact that Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are under occupation. And he succeeded until October 7th. But it's not only Netanyahu. I can ask you, you're European, even post-Brexit. How is Europe different? How is the United States different? Put this conflict on the back burner, control it, contain it. There are more important issues on the agenda: Ukraine, Russia, China, Pacific Rim, global warming. Don't let this local tribal conflict get in the way. Put it on the back burner. October 7th shattered the views of Netanyahu, but they also shattered the views of the EU, its member states, the UK, and the United States, at least temporarily. I fear only temporarily.
Where is the Arab world in this? There was the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia was talking about normalizing with Israel, very early discussions. Do you think the Arab world too had wanted to sweep this nascent conflict, I wouldn't say frozen, but bubbling conflict, under the carpet?
Well, first of all, things need to be qualified, because no government in the Arab world is more engaged and more responsible than the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and Egypt is not far behind. But let's talk about the normalizers. I did something which was socially unacceptable, and that is I didn't like normalization, and I expressed it. Now, I will get some of my followers angry. I'm a Zionist. And being a Zionist means I want the Jewish people to assume our rightful place at the table among the family of nations, and that includes the Emirates and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. I should be delighted that they are recognizing the legitimacy of the state of Israel, but I couldn't, because this was devised in such a way that it entirely ignored and marginalized the Palestinians. That was one of Netanyahu's prime objectives, neuter the Palestinian problem. And much of the Arab world basically said, all right, we'll pay lip service, go ahead. This war changed that, at least for now. And there is an awareness throughout the Arab world that the occupation of Palestine is an issue that is ignored only at great peril, not only to Palestinians. And that is an opportunity. I recently have been writing in the Arab press. Very odd. I'm a secular Israeli Jew trying to familiarize the people in the Arab world with the dynamics of the conflict, because there is the potential of a very positive role. One example, a while back, I had a Zoom meeting with somebody from the Emirates, and I have no contact with people in the Emirates directly on an ongoing basis. And we were talking about the erosion of the status quo at Al-Aqsa. And one of the participants sneered at me and said, yeah, but your prime minister doesn't listen to you, does he? And I responded, you're 100% correct. My prime minister doesn't listen to me, but he listens to you. And you have equity in Al-Aqsa. I'm not urging you to have a confrontation with Israel. I am urging you to exercise your leverage in order to protect the genuine Muslim and Arab equities at Al-Aqsa. That's the kind of thing that can happen. And we can pivot normalization in the service of ending occupation instead of bypassing occupation.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, Director of CMEC, and I'm speaking to Daniel Seidemann, Israeli attorney from Jerusalem. Daniel, turning back to Jerusalem for a moment, we've seen periodically flare-ups in the Armenian quarter and some troubling images coming from there. Can you update us on what's going on with that situation?
Well, there is clearly an attempt by Israelis to take over a significant part, a strategic part of the Armenian quarter of the Old City. Now, the Armenian community in Jerusalem is one of the most vulnerable Christian communities, a couple of thousand people. And this would be a severe and perhaps fatal blow to the viability of the community. Now, this is not an innocent real estate deal. I know, I've seen with my own eyes how the settlers of East Jerusalem are involved in this. And I have quite a good deal of evidence to that effect. There's no doubt, by the way, that the Armenian patriarch arrived at a deal without the knowledge of the community, and that's being hashed out in court. But in reality, what we are witnessing is part of a much broader Israeli policy, and that is to encircle the old city of Jerusalem with settlements and settlement-related projects in a way that fragments Palestinian East Jerusalem, establishes a certain biblical settler narrative engraved into the terrain and marginalizes the equities of Christians in Jerusalem. Fortunately, there are a young group of activists in the Armenian quarter who are a sight to be seen, who with their bare hands were able to put together an international campaign, seek legal assistance, find what's going on while keeping the community intact. So the Armenian quarter is a community at risk, but they're putting up a very admirable fight.
You describe yourself as a secular Zionist. Are we seeing, is it fair to say that we're seeing an increase in religious extremism amongst some communities of settlers? And how does that affect, if that is happening, the lives of Christians in Jerusalem, in Palestine, and in Gaza?
I have been telling this so often to people in positions of authority, including a number of foreign secretaries in the UK, that events in Jerusalem are being driven by religious pyromaniacs. Among the Jews, those religious pyromaniacs are the biblically motivated settlers who aspire to reestablish a biblical kingdom, or by the Temple Mount movement, which has various iterations. But we're not alone. Hamas has absolute claims to all of the land of Israel, but Al-Aqsa is at the core, and their claims are absolute, and they're exclusionary, and they're incendiary. And let's not leave out the Christians, because the base of President Trump are evangelical end of days Christians who see the religious radicalization of Jerusalem as a portender of the rapture. For years, I was arguing these movements are becoming stronger. But when Trump and Netanyahu were in power simultaneously, they weren't becoming stronger. They were power. I can think of no two people on the planet who are less pious, less men of faith than Netanyahu and Trump. But policy in Washington was dictated by end of days evangelists, and in Jerusalem by the Messianic religious right. If what I'm describing is correct, the fundamental causes of the war in Gaza have been influenced far more by what has been happening in Jerusalem than meets the eye, transforming a conflict from the political one, which can be resolved by mortal men and women, to a conflict of religious absolutes, in which we will have holy war, jihad, Melchemet Mitzvah, Armageddon, second coming, and then we can all go home.
That's a pretty bleak picture. Is there any way you see that not happening, or are you seeing this as something inevitable as our views become ever more polarized for whatever reasons?
Right before you called, I was working on a document about how do we plan for the near future, knowing that, as Gramsci said, the old world order is dead, the new world is struggling to be born. One of the things that I believe is possible is to secure the character of Jerusalem, restore the high ground to the traditional religious establishments who are not these pyromaniacs. And I'm talking about the chief rabbin, and I'm talking about the heads of churches in Jerusalem. I'm talking about the religious leaders and the heads of the Sharia courts. It's not touchy-feely interfaith, but it's a deep understanding that Jerusalem is Jerusalem because it allows the cohabitation of conflicting narratives. Jerusalem does that well. And I think one of the outcomes of this war is Jerusalem cannot be left to the religious extremes They have to be marginalized, and they can be marginalized. And the most powerful marginalizers are faith-based alternatives and secular leaders who are willing to protect this city. I think that's possible, and I think over time we're going to win.
The biblical settlers, biblically motivated settlers, are particularly active in the West Bank. Can you give a brief overview of what's happening while eyes are on Gaza in the West Bank? Is there an acceleration in activity there?
I say this with a bit of reluctance because my expertise ends at the Jerusalem city limits. So I'm speaking as an Israeli layperson, but obviously the settlers in the West Bank, and I'm speaking specifically of the extreme right national religious settlers, yes, those with messianic aspirations who are delighted with this opportunity and are taking full advantage of it, driving villagers out of their home, seizing their crops or destroying them, seizing their livestock. There's been an uptick in this, and it's not incidental, it's a pattern. They see this war as an opportunity to fulfill their dreams of an exclusively Jewish land of Israel with a submissive, passive Arab minority with no political rights. More important, from my perspective, than these hilltop youth is the attitude of the IDF. They're acting with impunity. The IDF has been allowed itself to be bullied into acquiescing to the crimes of the settlers. I'm a retired reserve major in the IDF, and I did serve in occupied territory, although on the cheap it was Sinai and the Golan Heights, but a bit in the West Bank. This is not the army I knew. It's not the army I knew. And I think we are letting ourselves off lightly, too lightly, if we fail to understand that occupation is not what Israel does, it's what Israel has become. And if we have to engage in deoccupation of Palestine, which I believe we do, we also have to deoccupy our souls.
So what has happened to the most moral army in the world? How did this come about?
We've witnessed the decay over time. The IDF has been transformed from an army that is to protect Israel from its external enemies into a policing, occupying power whose job is to repress a Palestinian population under occupation. In my years in the army, I was posted in the middle of the Sinai Desert in a tank battalion, and I watched before my eyes how Egypt was transformed from an enemy into an ally. I watched the signing of the peace agreement on a fuzzy television in Birt Madeh, and nobody will know where that is. And I spent time in the Golan Heights in preparation of a possible conflict with a state, with Syria, that remains. That was the center of gravity of the service in the IDF. And the time I spent in the West Bank was minimal, and discipline was strict. We did not abuse Palestinian residents. Yeah, there were exceptions. Yes, there were also discussions among senior officers off duty, expressing the absolute necessity for a political solution to this. And there was opposition within the army to orders coming from above that seemed problematic. And I am still proud of my Israeli army service. I'm not proud of what the army that I served in has become.
I'm Charlotte Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Daniel Seidemann from Jerusalem. Daniel, how has the population in Jerusalem, where you are, responded to reports that the IDF has withdrawn from Khan Yunis as we're recording? Does that seem like a shift in strategy? Does Netanyahu have a strategy? What's the response?
It's premature, but the withdrawal of all operational forces in Gaza and turning this into something of dealing with an insurgency is viewed by many as a defeat. We did not achieve the war's goals. Now, I don't believe the goal of the war was ever determined because Netanyahu believes in eternal conflict, and objectives to things like wars is not in his vocabulary. And Israel never really did determine the outcome of the war. But Netanyahu promised total victory without explaining what that was. There's a general sense that that is not the case, but it is also mixed with a quickening of the pulse, because unlike Netanyahu, the majority of the citizens of Israel prioritize the return of the hostages, those who remain alive. That is goal number one. And there's no price too large to pay for it. Now, that doesn't turn them into doves. Other than many will say, we will wipe them out afterwards. But the goal is bring them home. So along with this sense of stinging defeat, which for many is not a surprise, there's a great deal of anticipation of our being liberated from this enormous trauma and burden of having people snatched from their beds and taken into captivity.
One of the concerns that are often raised is that for the removal of every one Hamas asset, you're recruiting however many more. What's the effect of the war been on Palestinians who you know and mix with, on their attitudes towards Hamas?
One of the reasons that I think I've successfully maintained cordial and respectful relations with Palestinians who are dear, dear friends, I don't speak on their behalf. And I'm not going to do that now. All I can tell you is I know what's being discussed among young people in social media, not because I'm party to Israeli intelligence, because I've got friends in their 20s and 30s who are participating in the Facebook and the TikTok communications in East Jerusalem, which is huge. Palestinians tell me that Palestinian society is as traumatized, despairing, but resolute as ever before. And I was told by one of my friends, support or sympathy with Hamas is wall to wall. Don't confuse that with support of Hamas, which is very low. Now, I'm quoting somebody. I don't dare speak on behalf of Palestinian public opinion, but I think it's fair to say that this war has left two already scarred people dealing with things we've never dealt with before, and it would be folly to say anything conclusive about the state of mind of either people.
To finish with, Daniel, it's obviously was always going to be a very bleak discussion, and it has been. But you mentioned at the start of our conversation some shafts of hope. What does a possible resolution look like? Is there anything good that can come out of this horror and trauma that has affected, as you've said, people on both sides?
Let's take a look at Israel. First, the Israeli society has reinvented itself twice since the beginning of January 23 in ways that are not directly related to occupation. They were there, but they were certainly on the margins. One was deflecting a judicial coup d'etat by Netanyahu, which was extremely dangerous, and Israeli society won. And secondly, when the war broke up, it turns out that Netanyahu had gutted all of the governmental agencies and organs. They were empty shells. And Israeli society, in a state of emergency, functioned wonderfully because the citizenry fulfilled the role of government. I believe that with the trauma and the lurch to the right, all of these things are true. There is a large part of Israel that wants to reboot, start all over again, refound the state of Israel. One of the hostages said, I want my country back. We need to refound the state of Israel, and there will be new leaders. Internationally, today, everybody knows that Israel-Palestinian occupation cannot be ignored, and there has to be a difficult push forwards. That's genuine. I also have been around long enough to understand that they will forget that very quickly because they've been accustomed of not doing anything difficult. Today, in the Arab world, there is concern for the Palestinians and for Muslim holy sites in Palestine that needs to be encouraged. Will it survive the war? I don't know. Finally, I was saying for years, guys, if we continue this way, support for Israel isn't going to decline. It's going to collapse. And support of Israel has collapsed. It is extremely difficult to maintain support of Israel under Netanyahu's Israel carrying out the policies that it does. Israelis aren't traveling much now, and we're not exposed because the press is kind of a filter. We Israelis have no idea how isolated we are. How much, and in many quarters, we're already a pariah state. Now, I didn't want that. I want Israel to be held accountable. And there's been a difference between we oppose your policies and find them totally unacceptable. And some of them are war crimes. And that is valid. It's not always true, but it sometimes is. And those who basically say that our lesson from this is to make sure that Israel doesn't exist. I think much depends on our friends and remain friends in the UK, in Europe, in the United States to change the rules. We still support you, but not unconditionally. We will hold you accountable. When we say shared values, and shared interests, it's not a platitude that's empty of significance. We want to work with you in a way that's compatible with your interests and ours, but if you don't, there will be consequences. And I hope that that will emerge in the post-war period.
I'm Charlotte Leslie. You've been listening to CMEC's podcast, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of speaking to Israeli lawyer Daniel Seidemann from Jerusalem. Daniel, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Thank you.